Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is a video that kind of just popped up out of a short that I did, which was showing how to integrate Nuxt.js with Payload CMS. In Payload 2, I actually did a whole video series on integrating Vue and Nuxt with Payload CMS, and that's when Payload was kind of Express-based. Since it kind of moved over to being pretty much a Next.js project, I didn't really see kind of a scenario where someone would use Payload CMS to back a Nuxt.js application, two completely different skill sets, and so it just wasn't prioritized on my list of a video to update. But after I did the short, I got a fair bit of traction on people liking the short, looking at the short, finding it interesting, so I figured let me just walk through the solution that I did to integrate Nuxt with Payload and to upload the source code, so if somebody wanted to have a shot at it, they can kind of take it from there. So that's what this video covers. So thanks for stopping by. Please make sure you like and subscribe, share with your friends, and leave in the comments below if you think I should do more Vue.js/Nuxt integration with Payload CMS. All right, let's kind of get to it. This will just be a code walkthrough. Like I said, I'll post all the source code. So I'm not going to spend too much time covering the original setup of Payload CMS because that's covered in this video here. So let me show you. So I have this video called From Zero to Landing Page, a hands-on Payload CMS blocks tutorial, beginner's guide. And if you go to this video, let me pause this and scroll down. You can see here in the description, I have timestamps, so you could jump right to seeing how you set up. This is how you set up Payload. This is how you create the pages collection. This is how you handle the fields. And so you can see as you jump around that there's different sections on how I set up Payload to create the page that you're going to render from the backend perspective. If there's enough interest, maybe I'll create a stripped down version of this video that just focuses on building the backend. But for now, this is the reference that you should use. I'll keep a link in the bio. And also now that I'm here, notice that here's 43 other videos that I have. There are some shorts, but 43 other videos that I have on Payload CMS on my channel. Please make sure you check some of that out to get some more information on Payload. But that's how the backend got set up. So here's the result of the backend. So what happens is you go to Pages. I'm not going to create one, but inside of Pages, you create a title, slug, and then you go to Layout and you add objects. These are the only three objects that blocks that I have set up right now. I have a hero block, which is a heading, some subheading, and an image. I have the content block, which is basically just a heading and some rich text. And then you could add a call to action button. And then the last thing I do is I introduce a form. And so with the form, you have a heading and then you select the form to use. I have a newsletter form. And if we go to edit that newsletter form, you can see that it just takes the first name, last name, and email address. You could configure the button label, and you could configure a thank you message. Forms was integrated using the Forms plugin, which is also covered in that first video. But that's the baseline that we are using for the Nuxt application. And I'm using this form that I had created already. It's title called this landing page, slug is landing page, and then I have these three blocks that are in the layout right now. And it's the hero block, has an image, subheading, and title. It has the content blocks, which is just some text, and I added some rich text to kind of demonstrate the integration of rich text and rendering that in Nuxt. And then I have my newsletter, I have a heading, and then I've integrated that form that I showed you. So that's the backend. And just to show you what it looks like on the front end, so here is the rendering of the hero block. Here's the rendering of the content block, and here's the rendering of the form. So now let's take a quick walkthrough of the code. And I'll kind of mention some changes along the way that I had to make. So first off, here's how I set up the project. I basically just have my Nuxt app and my Payload CMS all in one project directory. A couple of changes that I needed to make to get this to play nice which are not included in the original video on Payload, is that first I needed to go into my, where is my payload source, payload config, and I added this cores because my Nuxt server is running on port 3001, so I had to add this into cores. That's one of the things I did. The other thing I had to do is, there's probably a cleaner way to do this, but this is the approach I took, is inside my collection, source collections, my pages, by default payload provides access control on collections, and so I needed to set read access on my pages collections to true so that my Nuxt application could access the page collection to get the information that it needed to render. So those are the only two changes I made that are not included in the video that I referenced earlier. Now, in my Nuxt app, sorry, this is just a basic Nuxt app that I built, but I needed to make some changes to get access to the payload types. So what I do is I have this script called sync types, and basically what it does is it copies the payload types from the payload directory into my Nuxt project here, and then I have my separate payload TS file here where I kind of just extract some types from the payload types file, kind of strip them down to make them easier to manage here for me. So here's the type for my hero block, the type for my content block, the type for my newsletter block. It just makes it easier to manage them and to get the type safety inside of my Nuxt application that I would normally get if I was writing my Next.js application. So that's what's going on here. So now let's kind of walk through how the app works. So we'll go to, well, let me just show some other specific configuration changes that I did with Nuxt. So here I set my payload URL because I need it inside my application. Here's where I set my dev server to default, the port 3001, and here's how I load in. I changed the font just to show an example of how to get the font into my application. So that's what happened there. The rest is just making the damn thing work. We go to our default page and we go to our Vue index. I tried my best to add JS.comments in here on what's going on throughout the application, but I'll just kind of talk at a high level through the flow. Trying my best to resolve all the errors in the application and make it nice and neat for you as a starting point. The basic premise here is that you fetch a page slug, and when you fetch the page slug, you get this document, and this document has the layout for the page you want to render, and inside the layout are all the blocks that you want to render. That's how this magic works. So if we go here and we take a look at the output, since I'm console logging a bunch of this stuff, let's refresh this so we get a clean set of output. So if we come here, we can see I am looking at, here's my page data. Let me kind of drill down into it. So this is the information from my page, which is all of this. All this information, actually it's the same thing that you get if you call this API. You can see here's all the information. So that's all we're doing here in our app. But we care about this layout object here because this is where all the good stuff is. So you can see here inside my layout, it has all the information that I want, and I'm going to iterate and I'm going to render each component based on its block type. So here we have our hero block type, we have our content block type, and then we have our newsletter form block type. And so what I do in my application is I create components to render each of these specific block types. And then we just render them. So like I said, the first part is to fetch the data. And so on mount, we fetch the page data. We set a reference variable here with the page. And then you can see here inside of our template, we loop through the blocks that are included in the page layout. And then we use this component map for all the component types. So I have my hero block component, my content block component, and my newsletter block component. And so based on the block type that comes from the block that we're looping through, we set this component to be that block type. And then we pass in all of the information that we got from the block as a parameter. And we just kind of loop through that, and that's how the page is rendered, by rendering each one of the specific component blocks that are here in this map. now that we have gone over how the flow works, let's start to take a look at each one of the blocks. So we'll start with our hero block first. So over here to components, hero block, and let's look at how this is going. So the property that gets passed in is the block. All right, so first I want to get this image URL. So I have this computed to get the image URL from the media object that got passed in as part of the block. Let's remove this, we don't need this either. And then here in my template, I'm going to take the heading. Let me show the API here so we can have it in front of us. So if we look over here, I am in my first block, and I take my heading. So that's the get payload, get latest on Payload CMS, and that is what's rendered here. Block heading. If there's a subheading, then we render it in the subheading. This is rich text. So what I had to do is I had to write my own component to basically parse this rich text and render it. So let's say, I don't think it's complete for all the different type of rich text objects that you can have inside of Payload, but it covers the ones that I have for now. I'll pass, I guess this will be included in the source code so you can update it to add the additional things that you need. So basically what it does is it parses this node tree to render the rich text in the UI. So as you can see inside of this render node, it literally just is based on a specific node type. So you can see node type is paragraph, node type is heading, list. Based on a node type, it renders the children appropriately and returns HTML to be rendered on the page. So that's what this rich text component does. Go back to my hero block. Then if there is a block image, we render the block image. Pretty straightforward. That's the hero block. The next block is this content block. So we'll take a look at the content block. Let's go back over here. Take a look at the API. So let's close the first one. And this next block in the layout, content, you can see it has the same rich text component in here. It has a heading and rich text component. So here inside of my content block, if there's a block heading, render the block heading. Otherwise, render this block content. I had some issues getting this type right, so that's why you're seeing this squiggly line. It passes the content in, the rich text component renders it, and you get the bullet item list here that is included. We go back to, where's my content? To my content here. Let's expand this. Because this rich text component is critical to using Payload CMS with Vue on the front end. Because if you can't render rich text, it kind of throws off the whole idea of the content management system. All right, so that is my content component, and then my form component is a little bit more complex. It's this newsletter block. Because what this newsletter does is this newsletter block does, it allows you to create this form which will capture this information and save it. So I'm Aaron Saunders, and I want to sign up for my newsletter, and when I click sign up, I get my thank you message showing here, and my information gets saved in a database. So now if I go back to Payload and I look in my form submission, what's today? Is today the 7th? Yes. Here's my new entry that was just submitted, and I get the fields, the values. So the first name, my last name, my email address got submitted. I look at the API, what's actually saved in the database. It saves all the fields. So this is the form information saves in fields, the confirmation message, but the real value is the submission data that I wanted. So that's what the form block does. What I'm calling it a newsletter block here. So if we go back and look at the code of what this thing is doing, so let's start at the top. We get passed in our block just like all the other components. And then same idea, we render the content based on what we get passed. So if we go back here and we look at the actual component, where am I? Yes, we're already here. The API that we're going to get back for the form, and this is all the information that are in it. Let's look at the top. We check to see if there's a heading field. If there's a heading, there is no heading, so we're not using that component. Then we'll circle back around to the form stuff. But here's the important part. We We're looping through to get the form fields that we want to render. We're looking for the fields with the name in it because we know those will be the ones that we want to render as UI elements for input. Then let's look at this first one. For example, we can see that it's fields. It has an ID that we use for the key. Then we have the label, which is the label. And then based on the type, we set the type of the input. So it's either email or text is what we currently support right now. We have the required field. We get the field name. And that's how we iterate through to get this list rendered. So that's how you render that list. Here's some UI code that will be based on the submit and the state of the submission. So let's kind of walk through that. So what happens is you enter all your user information, you click the sign up button. Since we're in a form here, when you click the sign up button, you call the function handle submit. Let's go up to handle submit. So we prevent the default action. We make sure that we're getting the information that we want passed in, that we actually have a value. We create some form state. So whether we're in the loading state, whether there's an error, and if we're in success or not. Then we pull the form data. We get the object entries, which are basically the name key value pair of the input that was entered in here. We need to call this API call back to Payload to submit the data for the form. And that endpoint is called form submission. You specify it's a post method, and then you stringify these parameters you need to pass. You need to pass the form ID. Then we need to iterate through these key value pairs that we got because the submission data object needs a field name and then it needs a value, which is the information that the user entered. We set the content type to application.json and we do a submit. If there's an error, we throw the error. We'll catch that at the bottom. Otherwise, we reset the form, which means clear all the information. We set loading to false, and then we set success to true. And so what that's doing is, you can see down here, if the form state is success and I have my confirmation message, which I do, because we can see confirmation type, confirmation message here, then what will happen is it will render the confirmation message using the rich text block. And so you get to see the confirmation. Let's just see. So I'm getting confused with what I wrote here. Let's put this in. You can see how the submit went away. Then it's showing our success message. And then when the 5 seconds are up, our button comes back. So that's what we're handling down here. Right, because since our form state does equal success, this button is not going to be shown. If there's an error, we render the error. If form is success, then we run the confirmation message. So that's how we're hiding the button after submission, showing the message. Once the 5 seconds are up, if we come back up here, see after our timeout, then we set loading to false, we set success to false, error to null. So that brings our button back. Sorry it took a while for me to kind of explain that. Sometimes it's easier to code it than it is to talk about it. So that's kind of where we're going to wrap this. Like I said, I'll post all the source code for you to take a look at. If it's something that you're interested in seeing more of, please let me know. And thanks for stopping by. Bye now.